Hello and welcome to the Monster Mechanics Podcast, where we take creatures of myth and media and see how they can be improved. I am your host, Scott Paladin, and with me as always is the turner to my hooch, Zach Jaquays. What are we talking about today, Zach?
This week we're talking about Mogwai.
So we're saying Mogwai specifically because we want to talk about the movie monster of the movie Gremlins and Gremlins 2, I guess. Although I haven't seen Gremlins 2 in a long time, so we're going to restrict ourselves a little bit to Gremlins 1.
I actually still haven't seen Gremlins 2.
Yeah, that's fine. So if you haven't seen Gremlins, which you should, it's a good movie. It's a kind of a splatter comedy from the 80s. There's this little furry creature called a Mogwai that a dude gets from a pretty racist depiction of a Chinese curio shop at the beginning of the movie. Mm-hmm. And he's been given some very specific rules. Don't feed it after midnight. Don't get it wet. And they are hurt by sunlight. Those 3 rules are it. So he takes it home and he gives it to his son. And over the course of the movie, all 3 of those rules get broken to varying effects. And it turns out that when you get them wet, they bud.
It's a gremlin bloom.
Little egg sacs pop. Yeah, little egg sac, little polyps fire out of them and then grow into new Mogwai. And if you feed them after midnight, then they turn into the gremlin, the adult form, I guess, like the evil form where they become all scaly and gross. And then they start running around the town and killing people. And then it turns out that the bright light is used to kill several of them. And then I think they blow the rest up in a theater. And it's a weird movie, and man, the Gremlins do not make sense. Like Mogwai as a species, like this is some buck-ass wild rules, and I think there's room for us to do some stuff with that.
Yeah, I think so. I feel like the first, and the thing that's like bothered me even before I saw the movie, because I knew the rules, like it's kind of a cultural touchstone. When you grew up in the 80s, you know about Gremlins, you know about the rules for them. But like don't feed them after midnight bothered me even as a child, because like when is it no longer after midnight?
We need an end date. Like if it's specifically between like midnight and sunrise, is that the rule? Or that seems kind of like an arbitrary thing, right? Like why is it midnight specifically? Mm-hmm. That's so stupid. There's a theory that I've read around the internet, which was interpreting that as a sort of vague reason to not feed them in the middle of the night, because if you like they are hurt by a sunlight, and so they're at their greatest amount of power and therefore can change into their adult form if you feed them in the middle of the night. And the way that people seem to have described that is after midnight, which is dumb. I don't think that works. If you're going to say don't feed them in the middle of the night, I think that should be actually the rule. So I had an idea for how to make a little bit of sense, which is along the same sort of lines, which is that it's a little bit like the axolotl, what we talked about a few episodes ago, where they can pupate from their juvenile form into their adult form if certain conditions are met. And so what they need to have is a large caloric intake that is separated in time from being exposed to sunlight. So if after the sun goes down, you have a few hours where you could totally just safely feed them, and they won't, because they are still recovering from being damaged by ambient sunlight, they can't enter their pupal form. But in that time between, like, say, midnight, somewhere in the course of the late night to the morning, if you feed them during that period, then they have like that gives them the energy in order to form that pupal state. You can't rely on the sunlight to stop that because they will have already begun the transformation. So it's a little bit less like don't feed them after midnight, and a little bit more like don't feed them between 6 and hours after sunset. Like that becomes a more specific rule.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, don't feed them after midnight seems like a reasonable like shortening of that idea, or something that like maybe that seems like a good general rule. So I think that makes sense.
Maybe there's like some kind of microorganism or bacteria that builds up on them that is destroyed by sunlight, but it like generates really rapidly over their body. And so like as soon as like the lights are out, like that starts building up, and like if there's enough of that on them, by the time they start eating, like they go into that sort of that metamorphosis stage. I
like the idea of the layer of bacteria. Maybe that actually interacts with the don't get them wet problem. Mm-hmm. Like, so even in the movie they call out like don't feed them, like don't give them water even to drink. Apparently will cause them to reproduce. But like we see it, there's a scene literally where a dude drops a single drop of water onto a gremlin's back, and it explosively fires like a chunk of flesh out of its back, which then turns into another Mogwai. That's fucking weird, right? Like,
well, and the other thing is like snow doesn't appear to follow the same rules there, which
exactly
bothered the hell out of me when I watched it. But
and like they eat fried chicken at one point, like on screen, and they don't reproduce from that. And like meat is mostly water. Like there is like 50% water in that. So the rules of water versus not water is really weird to me.
And then like in that final scene when what was the
you're thinking of Stripe.
Yeah, when Stripe's like about to plunge his head into the fountain and he's just getting splashed by it and he's building up to it, but
he literally sticks one index finger into the water and it like starts like causing him to start to reproduce. That's so weird. And like the one of the like sort of the move into Act 3 or Act 2, I guess it is. I forget the 3-act structure of films, but the move from like things getting escalated is that character literally jumps into a pool and like hundreds of gremlins come out. But if literally any gremlin can reproduce by getting water, it seems like if you throw them in the pool, you get like a logarithmic expansion. You get an exponential growth. Like you should have billions of those things because every one of them that is created also creates more.
And like that is the water like consumed in this process? Like
it doesn't seem
otherwise,
to be.
If that's the case, like just when does it stop?
Yeah, like could you throw them in the ocean and end up with the entire world's surface covered in gremlins?
I mean, that'd be a very real reason for that warning of don't get them wet.
Yeah, I guess maybe you could argue that maybe salt water wouldn't trigger the same trick. And maybe actually that could explain some of the other things too. Like maybe Gatorade wouldn't work because it's got salts and sugars in it, and like that's why like orange juice maybe wouldn't work. Like it's got to be pure water. I don't know. I still don't like the fact that like you get them wet and like within minutes there's another full-grown Mogwai. That violates all kinds of like conservation of mass. Yeah. So I think we could make that work though by scaling it back just like to a more reasonable level.
Maybe like the Mogwai are like Suriname toads, and they just have like all their young just embedded in their skin. And like they're also like sea monkeys. Yeah. Where as soon as you get them wet, they just expand into being.
So what I'm thinking is maybe they're in their natural environment, there's a dry season and a wet season. So there is a period of time where they're living in like a desert where there's just no flowing liquid water. But then there's a season where they are the place floods and you get huge rivers of flowing water and you get torrential rainstorms, monsoons or something like that. And that's the period of time when they are supposed to like reproduce and raise their young because that's when all the food and water is available and resources are easier. So they, like you said, like Suriname toads, they have little eggs built into their skin, like embedded there. And it's literally just the triggering of getting wet consistently. And maybe you have it where it's not just a single drop of water will hatch an egg, but it's like if they're in a wet, moist environment for a long period, for a week or so, then they start hatching. And that's a much more reasonable biological explanation for why that would happen. If you like keep them in a terrarium that's all dry with no flowing water, they're never going to enter that reproductive state. They're only just going to like hang around and be, stuck in their dry season version. And then during the wet season, they like, get exposed to a lot of moisture and they hatch the egg sacs out of their backs. That seems actually completely reasonable to me. They could also be, there are some species of, I think lizard, but I know there's some insect species that are basically born pregnant. Like they hatch with all of the fertilized eggs they're already always going to have already within their body. So gremlins could work the same way, where they don't have they're a single gendered species, and they're all female essentially. And when they are born, they've already got those eggs embedded in their skin, and embedded in their skin's gross as by the way.
Oh yeah.
We didn't put a trypophobia warning on the beginning of this episode, but maybe we should, because that is the Suriname dove is the thing that sends my guts flowing up the back of my throat. Like I hate that.
They're awful to look at.
Yeah. Well, naturally we're going to link it in our show notes, a video of
course,
of some of that coming out. If I can stand to confirm that it's the right video, because that one really throws me. I guess, that maybe that wet season, dry season dichotomy might also explain the two appearances. Like, because we've got the Mogwai, the like cute little furry guys, and then you have the gremlin form, which they're able to advance to later. And that one, maybe one of those is more suited to one of the two environments. Like the furry one is maybe I don't know. Maybe the furry one is the dry season creature because the fur acts as a good insulator. And so it's actually pretty good for both hot and cold temperatures, allows them to regulate their internal temperature better. And like it helps them stay warm during the very cold desert nights. And it helps them, they may have something else for cooling themselves down during the day, like a dog panting or something like that. Because there's lots of like camels are furry and stuff like that. So maybe that's the dry season variant.
I could see that.
In the natural environment, what happens is they go through a single season of the dry season. They are already pregnant. So then the wet season comes and they start reproducing and they produce more of the little Mogwai. In this sense, where I guess we're thinking of them as having little babies that don't grow up in like 10 minutes the way they do in the movie. They probably have maybe an entire season of having to care for their young. And during that time, they're eating a lot more because it's the wet season. And so there's a lot more food. And so they're eating large amounts of calories at night. And that's what causes them to turn into their adult form, which is the gremlin form, the one with no fur and lots of or very little fur, because like, Stripe still has a mohawk. So they have much less fur. And they're also bigger and more dangerous and able to like hunt better, for lack of a better term, because they are larger and much more dangerous. They have like claws now and things like that.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that bothered me about the Gremlins movie was there didn't really seem to be a reason for them to change. Like they're still homicidal little assholes even when they're in their Furby form.
Yeah.
Except for Gizmo for some reason.
Except for Gizmo, who's just innately good, I guess. But if you're dealing with a form that has been actually, just backing up half a second.
Yeah, no problem.
Their fur being an adaptation for their dry season, because in deserts it gets very, very cold at night. So, but they're also going to be hiding during the day, so it's less important for them to be like able to shed lots of heat during the day, is because they're going to be burrowing. They're going to be entirely nocturnal, so they're going to be much more about keeping themselves warm at night, which explains why they're furry. I think. And then they have to worry less about that during the wet season, which I'm going to assume is maybe a bit warmer at night, but also water retains, it dampens the swing between heat during the day and water and cold at night. So you more regulate the temperature, so they don't need the fur as much. And if it's cloudy, maybe they're more able to go out during the day, unlike during the dry season. That's cool. But yeah, the idea of it being like the Mogwai version, like the juvenile version, the little Furby guy, it's basically about like just surviving through the dry season. It's just about like making it through the 6 months of the year so that you can get to the wet season. And so they're smaller, so they require less food. They are furry, so they can move around at night when it's very cold. And maybe also smaller because it means burrowing is easier. Like you don't have to make as big a den because they're small. But they're also not able to take down larger prey. They're not able to move as quickly across the land because they've got short little legs. So the wet season comes around and they have a couple of triggers, one that causes them to reproduce and one of them that makes them turn into the gremlin form, who is larger and much more able to gather food quickly, which it then uses to feed to the offspring. So it's more about caring for its little family than it is about just being an asshole.
Something that was very much not established in the movies.
No. I imagine like the reason why they're assholes is because they either are sentient or are nearly sentient. They're like little chimps, right? Like they have no morality, and they're also like during their gremlin form, they're like an apex predator. They don't fear anybody. Like in their natural environment, maybe they're top of the food chain, which explains why they're such little like audacious little assholes about it.
I wonder if there's something to follow with them being like reverting back to like their Mogwai form at some point. Like if they aren't able to maintain high enough calorie intake. Otherwise, like I would imagine that, like their life cycle would last like basically one season.
I was thinking that it might be like they could act a bit like salmon, where like they're meant to make it through 1 year and then back to the mating cycle, the wet season when they do all of their reproduction. And then the gremlin form isn't able to sustain through the dry season. And so they might actually just die off. Or you could have it where they revert back to the Mogwai form for the dry season. Either of those seem reasonable. Both of those have disgusting options where like in the one version they starve to death at the end of the season and like you see all these like gremlin corpses at the end of the season, like rotting in the sun, or drying up and frying in the sun. The other version is that you have the awfulness of like the gremlin shedding like parts of itself in order to turn back into the Mogwai form. Like you have the skin sloughing off and like their limbs shrinking back and stuff. Because most creatures don't shrink ever. They either just get bigger or not. Like,
or maybe they consume their own mass to survive.
Oh, they like bite their fingers off and then like, ew, that's gross. Okay. I mean,
because the thing that I'm worried about is like where do more Mogwai come from if like they all mutate during this one season?
I'm thinking that maybe what we saw in the movie, all of that happens way too quickly, right? Like, so I'm thinking that the young grow up over the course of that wet season from the little furry form into the, well, not furry form, but then from like an infant form into the juvenile form, and that takes the expanse of the dry or the wet season, so that they're ready to survive the dry season on their own when their parents die off. And so that takes a while. It's not like they don't have enough time to get up and then turn into a gremlin themselves during the wet season. But if they did, they wouldn't make it past. So like that's a very specific sort of life cycle there. And it would be really thrown off if you brought them into the wild here. Like they'd probably be a wild invasive species here in the US, right?
So are the Mogwai like do the gremlin form? Does the gremlin form give birth to the Mogwai form?
I'm inclined to say yes. That like,
because that's even worse than the Suriname-tope. You have little hairballs just caught in those giant oversized pores.
Yes. Yeah. One thing that bugs me about the movie is the idea that, because in the movie, if you're a Mogwai and you get wet, you make more Mogwai. If you're a gremlin and you get wet, you make more gremlins. That's stupid. You can't just have it where, gremlins make gremlins and Mogwais make Mogwais. Like that makes them almost seem like two separate species right there that just happen to be joined by one turning into the other, which I don't dig that.
All because they ate something after midnight.
Yes. And it would make an interesting contrast where like you have the little Mogwai version, which is it's all about just getting through that dry season. They're just living out there in the rocks and like eating what they can find and like, I don't know, cracking open cactuses to drink the water out of the middle, but they don't reproduce. So if you got them wet, what you'll end up with is just a wet Mogwai, but you need to have them turn into that gremlin form, and it needs to do the gremlin transformation first because then it is equipped to feed its offspring, right? Like it has to go through that process in order to be able to gather enough food and hunt enough prey in order to bring back kills. Oh, no, there's no way. Okay, which is worse? Does it bring back either dead or nearly dead creatures to feed to the babies? Or does it swallow them and then regurgitate awful stuff into the like bird style?
Definitely the latter.
Yeah. There's also the option of, do you know what crop milk is from pigeons?
Do I want to?
Maybe. It's not super gross. Crop milk is pigeons, and I think a couple of other bird species produce for lack of a better term, milk out of a gland in their throat. And it's like mammal milk. It's very, very fatty and full of nutrition. And so instead of regurgitating full, like if a pigeon goes and eats a hot dog off the sidewalk and they fly back to their nest, instead of just regurgitating hot dog into their young's mouth, they actually produce this milk, which they then feed to the young.
So what you're telling me is pigeons are just the worst dragon ever.
I was going to say it's you could totally have pigeon milk. Like you could totally have a little carton of it at the store, and it'll probably be the next thing that the health craze is all about, this super good for you pigeon milk. So that's an option too. You could have the gremlins. Oh, okay. Our version of it, if that's the case, then like I feel like they've got a sac that develops in their neck when it's full. Like obviously the Mogwai don't ever need to do this because they're never going to feed young, but like the gremlins, as they're like going out and gorging themselves on food and converting that nutrition into crop milk, they end up with this big like,
they're just like getting a giant goiter under their necks.
Yeah, exactly. A goiter, or I was thinking like the inflation from like a pelican can do, or like a toad when they're gonna croak. You got that big bubble that like flops around as they move, and like you can see that it's like filled with like a gelatinous.
Oh, I hate that.
Yeah. And then when they come to feed their cute little furry babies, they like open their mouth and you see that stuff like coming up out of the. Oh, that's gross. do not like, but that's the point, really.
That would definitely move the Gremlins movie firmly into the realm of horror rather than just.
They were, yeah. Our version is a lot less funny, but is definitely still horror.
Yeah.
Okay. Complete aside about the Mogwai and the Gremlins themselves. What the f was up with the inventor subplot of that movie? Why the hell is the dad an inventor? And they like keep showing off how shitty all of his inventions are. And like, I cannot understand what the structure of the why that is added into the structure of the movie.
I feel like it was just like a way for them to have like elaborate mousetrap style, like destruction of the Gremlins themselves.
Yeah, because they do throw one in a juicer at one point, but it like they just put one in a regular old microwave as well. You don't need to like, and like the juicer, you could have totally just used a like a blender or something. Like I'm not quite down on that, although. It is hilarious to me that it opens with a film noir style narration and like where the inventor dad is like walking around in a fedora and trench coat on a like dingy city street, and it's being narrated like he's Philip Marlowe.
They really had a hard time settling on a tone for this movie.
Yeah, not to be outdone by the scene where they're in like a toy store and the main character is hanging out with that girl that he wants to bunk, and she just like randomly tells him a sad story that has a punchline about her dad dying. By the way, we should have said earlier, we're going to spoil the whole of this goddamn movie, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, I feel after about 30 or so years, you've got your window of opportunity there has firmly shut. Yeah.
The statute of limitations is long gone. But anyway, so they're in a toy store, I guess, looking for something to fight the Gremlins with. And he asks her, because this is a stealth Christmas movie, by the way. This all happens at Christmas. And he's asking the girl, like, why she doesn't like Christmas. And she tells a story about how her dad was going to go down the chimney as Santa Claus, got stuck and died. And that they found out on Christmas. And it ends with the line, and that's why I hate Christmas. And it's like, why did you tell this story in this way? Why is this story in the movie at all? It's never brought up again. It's like, you could have just dropped the whole thing from the edit and it would have been fine. But they're like, no, we got to keep that weird ass Christmas Santa death story in here.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you can't tell, this movie does have some structural problems. It's fun. I would recommend seeing it, if only so that you understand what's going on in the rest of the world. But like, it's a ride. Okay. Back onto our bullshit about making gremlins into a more reasonable species. So how would these new gremlins feature into the same sort of story? Like, could we make, obviously our version of it's probably not going to be a comedy because it takes itself just a little too seriously. But like, how do these creatures interact with a story? If you wanted to tell them, bring them into like a movie or a short story or something like that.
Like, I feel like the invasive species angle is the way to go with it.
Yeah.
Like, kind of like the stories of like people getting like pet alligators and then flushing them down the toilet, and now there's giant alligators in the sewer. You've kind of got like kids who get these Mogwai for Christmas or whatever, and then like decide, oh, this is more of a hassle than I was willing to put up with. Release them into the wild,
or they just escape or something like that. We're like, because they're relatively intelligent, so keeping a handle on them would be kind of difficult. If they can drive tiny cars, which is a thing that happens in the movie, then obviously they can work out door handles and cage latches and things like that and get out.
And also learn to play poker, apparently. So clearly very intelligent creatures.
Yeah, like I said, they're smarter than chimps. Like, they're more like, I don't know if you can compare them to dolphins even. They're just a little bit dumber than humans, as is evidenced by the fact that they did not.
I mean, I don't even know that that's fair. They just don't have the experience to build on that humans do.
So, okay, maybe they're from an environment that has a very clearly defined dry season and wet season. So there are places in Africa that are like this. There's places in, I think, the Indian subcontinent that's like that as well, where you have this dramatic difference. So we're imagining them as having been brought in and like given to a child, or a subset of them, like a population is brought in. And I was just thinking, so maybe the distinction is in their natural environment, they're kept in check by that cycle where the Mogwai, the cute little furry form, grows into the gremlin form, and then the gremlin form can't survive the next season. So like at the end of the season, they die. And that acts as a big check on their population control, because the version of the species that can reproduce is only around for 3 months out of the year during when there's lots of resources, and then they spend 9 months out of the year, in a reproductive form that is mostly about just like surviving to the next wet season. But if they are introduced to a temperate climate like our own, where there's lots of moisture around all of the time,
you could have the gremlin apocalypse in Seattle.
Exactly, or I'm thinking it's like it's like the rabbit wars they had to fight in Australia, where like you introduced rabbits to an environment where they didn't have a lot of natural predators, and you end up with like fields of rabbits, like literally like these just huge masses of uncontrolled species. And it's like that, except gremlins, who are much more dangerous and like threatening than rabbits would be.
As an aside, can we just mention that it's weird that Australia has had at least 2 wars against animals, and they lost one of them?
Yeah, they lost the emu war for sure. Yeah, man, there's a whole thing about like introducing invasive species into Australia as like a giant case for why you should never allow that to happen. But yeah, so like if these things get out, because there's lots of water in the environment and comparatively more animals for them to eat, because we're assuming they're predators, I'm just deciding, they spend a lot more time in that adult form, and that adult form it's born with lots and lots of egg sacs embedded in its skin, so it just keeps reproducing. And over the course of like maybe even just a single 3-month period, 4-month period, they're increasing exponentially, and they're like, their population just skyrockets, and they're all these dangerous little creatures. And so like you could imagine a town being absolutely beset by these creatures over the course of a season. That would be really cool and very scary.
Yeah, like I think in this case, like maybe because like their life cycle is generally like so short, like their upper limit on like size, aggressiveness, cleverness is never really discovered. But because they can survive so long in like these densely populated places where there's tons of calories available, like they can just become more and more dangerous and more numerous.
Yeah. And they get like bigger and like they get more experience, so they get smarter over time. Like I've already talked on the podcast about watching the extermination of pigs videos on YouTube, and them talking about how like you can catch the pigs in a kind of trap once. Like if you catch like a couple of them in the trap, that's not good enough, because then the ones that survived will never go near it again. And you can imagine that gremlins being the same way. Like if you don't catch all of them, then whatever worked the first time doesn't work the second time, because they've learned. And that makes them very dangerous. And yeah, you can imagine maybe it's even like I was talking about it being a temperate environment, but maybe it's specifically urban environments, because there's lots of flowing water around to trigger the reproduction. And then also human cities are full of calories. Like if they get themselves into a shopping market or shopping mall or a supermarket or something like that, they're just going to be able to gorge themselves on Twinkies and Doritos until like they turn into gremlins. And then they have all of that food to take back and convert into crop milk to feed to their babies. And those babies are going to grow up very quickly. Yeah, they're like the ultimate version of urban foxes. They're a species that is really well adapted to our environment.
And because like we have so much man-made structures and whatnot, like there's tons of shelter from sunlight. So like
exactly,
they're not even necessarily like concerned about that aspect as much.
Yeah, you can imagine them just going in and taking over sewer systems. Like that's where they're all hiding out, or like abandoned buildings and things like that, where they can hide during the day, and then or like subway tunnels too. Or like, and there's all those utility tunnels and things like that under buildings. That would be a perfect environment for them. So in a way, we inadvertently created an incubation chamber for the gremlins that they can travel out exponentially. And I guess that explains why like it's almost a controlled outbreak at that point. Like you'll lose an entire city to these creatures possibly, but then like they're going to have a hard time moving from that city into like the next one or something like that, unless they like stow away on a truck or something like that. And so you can imagine like checkpoints coming in and out of a infested city where they're like blowing flamethrowers underneath the undercarriage of the semi trucks and like checking through all of the contents and things like that.
Checking for Minox and Mogwai.
Yeah, or whatever those parasites were in Fifth Element, where they're in the landing gear.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Like they're just like tentacly like koosh balls, basically like alien koosh balls. Maybe that's so one of the things we have an alternative form for their survival too, which is like or their spread, which was I had been thinking that little Mogwai need to be raised. Like they have a hard time surviving on their own. But maybe it's possible for them to like, I was going to say, maybe they have an alternate form of spreading where they could like leave the egg sacs on their own and then have them hatch on their own as well when they got wet or something like that. So then they could like, in this scenario, the reason I'm doing it is so that they could attach to like just the egg sacs to the undersides of railway cars or semi trucks or something like that and have them spread.
So I got a gross angle for this. If you want to explore that. Like I kind of like the idea that maybe like they molt or something and like leave behind like basically like husks, like gremlin husks or whatever.
I like it. I'm down.
That the egg sacs or like that the hatched gremlins can eat.
Yes. Oh, that's cool. Okay, so maybe that's a Okay, so maybe if we're gonna drop the idea of them raising their young, and instead it's just about like getting as many calories during the course of the wet season as possible. And they're just trying to get as big as possible because as they get bigger, they molt more and more. Like every time they like a crab or a lobster or something like that, or a reptile, as they grow, they have to shed their skins in order to get bigger. And every time they do that, they leave behind a cache of both nutrients, but then also just the eggs, because we said that they were embedded in the skin. So if they're able to, like under normal circumstances, like a lean year, maybe they'd get to molt once. And on like a boom year, when there's lots of rain and lots of creatures for them to eat and they do really well, maybe they'd molt 3 or 4 times. But if they get into an urban environment, they can do it almost continuously. Like it just happens over and over again. And you have these little like, and then they become insidiously hard to get rid of in infestation because you catch an adult one, you also have to catch all of the little caches of egg sacs and skin resources that it's left behind.
Oh, that's awful. Yeah.
And if you don't catch all of those, in a couple of weeks, you're just going to get more of them back.
How does humanity deal with an infestation like this? We've talked about having like checkpoints.
I definitely like the checkpoint idea because like you have to go through everything and look for gremlin skins, you know, these molting remnants. I wonder if there's a way for like, you could also imagine like UV weapons, like because I'm imagining if we haven't talked about it very much at all, but if they're harmed by bright light, that it's almost certainly the high concentrations of UV light that's in sunlight that is damaging to them. It's the same thing that gives you a sunburn. And so it's not hard to imagine a creature with a cellular structure that is very susceptible to UV light. And so it like literally, unlike us where, we get a sunburn after 10 minutes, it's literally more like they walk out in the sun and they're something about their biological structure starts to break down quickly. And so you could imagine like exterminators walking around with big old LED powered UV spotlights and like shining them up in your attics and stuff, or even like you could have them installed in places where humans aren't normally. Like you could have them in your crawl space or in your attics or something like that, where you like literally every once in a while you have to turn on the UV lights in all of the like parts of your house in order to like clear out the infestation. That's really cool. And then like people have to pay a lot of attention because like we mentioned it before, I think maybe they're a little bit more capable of surviving on like a cloudy day. So like people sort of rely on bright sunny days to keep these things in check a little bit because it means they can't move around as much during the day. But on like, if you have 5 weeks where they're cloudy, then they'll have multiplied in that time and like they'll have had more opportunities to go out and get food, things like that. And so like, that you're going to have more infestations after that. And you have to like go and actively hunt them down after it's been raining for a little while. Yeah,
I think that definitely becomes like a real threat rather than like what's presented in the movie.
Yeah. And in the movie, like 2 teenagers and a Mogwai take care of all of the other gremlins. And I think this is more like an existential threat of like just a biological thing that's gone wrong. And if they're nearly sentient, you can also imagine like this huge moral problem with the humans being like, dude, these things like scream when we kill them. Like, and like some of them cry and like call out the names of their dead friends. Like, this is really hard to like, this takes a psychological toll on us.
Yeah.
Because probably a lot of them are assholes, but maybe they wouldn't all be assholes. That's very interesting. But like, nonetheless, like because of the way their biology works, like you have to do something about them because you're competing with them for resources. And like, I imagine a pack of gremlins could take down a human and eat it, like eat them. Yeah. Like they're a real threat and they have no qualms about like killing us. They're very dangerous. Oh yeah, can you imagine you're like in a you're walking down the street of like a dense urban area, you know, a big city like New York or something like that, and you like turn a corner and you can like see a bunch of glowing eyes at the end of an alleyway, and like you hear the noises of that, like, oh yeah.
And like any condemned buildings are like that much more dangerous because you just know they're just rife with these moltings of gremlins.
Oh yeah. So you either have to pay people to come in and sweep them out, or just like it becomes a policy that like if a building is empty for a long enough time, they just burn it to the ground. You know, they just knock it down because it's too dangerous to leave on its own. That's cool. And then like cities that are above the Arctic Circle might be in a special danger because for a couple of months out of the year, there's nothing keeping them in check during the day. And now that maybe they would have a harder time in the cold or something like that because they don't have any fur. Although the ones in the movie seem just fine walking around in the middle of snow.
They also wear clothes too. So
how did they get so many custom-sized, like gremlin-sized clothes?
Yeah, I think that's the least concerning thing about that movie.
The problem is that there's so many concerning things about that movie. Like there's so many problems.
They really do add up.
Like at one point they show up at a bar and they're all drinking and carousing and stuff. And the female lead of the movie is like just kind of serving them for a really long time and like trying really hard to like get them drinks and stuff. And I'm like, why didn't you just run away, lady? Like, this is very strange. Why did you like stop to do they're not paying, obviously. They can't be tipping you. What is in this for you?
Yeah.
I do have to praise the fact that at one point, and like towards the end of the movie, there's the main villain gremlin who is Stripe, who has a mohawk, and like at one point he just gets a gun, and he has a gun, and there's a moment where they're like, oh no, he's got a gun, and I love the fact that they're like, yeah, as dangerous as these things are, give him a handgun and he's much more dangerous, and I really like it's just like something about that quality really pleases me.
With them having a human level intelligence, I'm wondering like what their sociological niche becomes if they're allowed to flourish.
I mean, it kind of obviously if they're as varied as humans, then like they're just people and like they could do anything they want. And they could have nations and things like that. Mm-hmm. I wonder because they're not it really depends a lot on how social they are amongst themselves. Like if they're loners and they don't like other gremlins, then it's really hard for them to like develop a society. And it also means that they're going to be very much inclined not to trust humans as well. Like any other creature, like they don't have any of the mechanisms that are built into their brain to help them cooperate. Like we've got a bunch of stuff in humans that are like, we are meant to find other humans and like cooperate with them. We don't always do that, but like we have things like empathy that are built into our brains that are like there for us to like, oh, I like you, I know you, you are like me, therefore I am going to have some feelings towards you. And that could be, that's not completely universal, but it is part of us. And so you can imagine that a species that never does that never works together, never builds a tribe, never lives as a family, might just be completely incapable of it. And like, they're all little sociopaths, you know, like they're complete little psychos. And that would explain their behaviors because they have none of those inclinations. In which case they like a society of sociopaths doesn't work. Like they can't work. If they can't work together like that, then they're not going to form a society. They're not going to form a civilization because they're just never, and that requires more than one person to do. And they're just incapable of working as groups. That's that I'm not sure they would have a sociological niche in that case. They would just be these little. I
do kind of like the idea of them as more of an infestation rather than a society.
Yeah, and you could have, and there's probably are stories to tell because you can't imagine that that they're all exactly alike. Like this may be a thing where it's like if you, God, this comes into some territory that maybe is problematic, but like if you were to raise one in a society where you could teach it like things like empathy and stuff like that, and it might have a hard time learning, it might develop into a more cooperative individual. And there's like, I don't on the one hand, I don't want to say like these things are all doomed. If they're sentient creatures, they're not like necessarily doomed by their own blood to be evil, because that kind of has some problems to it. But also like if they're a biological species that really was innately different in their brain construction than ours, they really might be like severely unlike humans. You know, like they might have things that make them incompatible with, you know, with each other and with us. So I'm not sure. You have to, as an author, you have to figure out where in that line, where in that gray area you wanted to fall, or if you wanted to avoid it entirely.
Yeah.
we definitely don't want to get deep into the discourse about like innately evil races from D&D and stuff like that again.
Oh yeah. That's a minefield for sure.
Oh yeah. And not something that we're necessarily qualified to do a lot of talking about is the real issue. As two white guys, which, you know.
Yeah.
And well, I think we've got a much more reasonable version of these Gremlins. Obviously ours is not going to be a horror comedy. I think it's going to be a straight up like infestation horror. Mm-hmm. It's going to feel a lot more like a zombie apocalypse movie than anything else.
Yeah.
But it does solve some of these like innate problems.
Oh yeah. I think there's definitely a little more structure to the way Mogwai work in this version.
Yeah, yeah. And really just, really it's and it wasn't about changing anything fundamental about them. It's really just about like pulling the levers back a bit. Which obviously the way that they were shown in the movie was all about the making that movie work in the time frame and in the format they wanted it to. But it's not a completely unreasonable idea if you just like I said, pull everything back, pull those levers back so that it's much more reasonable. Well, that's great. I guess in that case, we're done. So bye.
All right. Till next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Monster Mechanics Podcast. If you'd like to rate or review our show, we'd love for you to do that. You can do that on Podchaser or on the iTunes store. If you rate us on iTunes and you're not in the US, Great Britain, or Australia, let us know so that we can go check that out. We'd love to hear them. And now for the credits. Monster Mechanics is produced and edited by me, Scott Paladin, and hosted by myself and my best friend, Zach Jaquays. All of the ideas generated during this podcast are released under a Do What the Fuck You Want public license. All of the ideas generated during this podcast are released under a Do What the Fuck You Want public license.